So I know I'm a digital person, but I'm sorry, this presentation is not going to be very digital oriented, so lower your expectations ahead of time. So I know I'm supposed to come up here and talk about what I'm doing at the Boston Globe, but I actually wanted to take this in a different direction, which is um, setting the tone with some of the questions, some of the issues that Vivian has raised and that Kinsey raised ahead of her. I just want to pose some questions that we, as news organizations, really should be thinking about if we aren't today. And to do that, I want to start with a story that was recounted to me from Professor Christensen several years back when I was working with him on our paper. And it's a story about how Dell, a company that started right here at UT Austin in a dorm room and moved up the street, but it's a story about how Dell moved from being a personal computer behemoth upmarket into microprocessing and other things. And I think that there are lessons in this story that can apply to news organizations as well. So the story starts with a company called ASUSTeK, based out of Taiwan. ASUSTeK began their life making simple circuit boards, which they were very good at, and they were Dell's largest customer. So one day, ASUSTeK went to Dell with a value proposition. And they said, you know, Dell, we've been making these simple circuit boards for you, but you know, we really know how to fabricate these things, and why don't you let us take care of your motherboards as well, and we'll take care of that and guarantee you a 20% reduction in cost. Dell considered it, thought long and hard with their analysts, said, wow, you know what, that's a really good deal. So they agreed to let ASUSTeK take over their motherboards. A couple of years later, ASUSTeK went back to Dell and said, you know what, Dell, we have an interesting value proposition for you. Why don't we take over your computer assembly? I mean, we know how to do the motherboards. We know how to do the simple circuit boards. Dell's analysts looked at it, said, you know what, this is actually great for us. We won't increase our revenue, but we'll certainly increase our profitability because we'll be cutting a lot of the costs that go into making these computers. For ASUSTeK, it's a good deal because they grew their profit and they grew their margins by going upmarket and expanding their overall market. A couple of years later, ASUSTeK went back to Dell with an interesting value proposition. Have you heard this before? So they went to Dell and said, you know what, we do all this computer assembly, we do all these motherboards, we do all these circuit breakers. It makes sense for us to take care of the supply chain. It's not really what you do. You're a phenomenal brand. You have great value and prestige in the market. Well, we can do that stuff for 20% lower margins. So of course, Dell said, yes, thank you. And they took over the supply chain and logistics. A couple of years later, ASUSTeK went back to Dell one last time with an interesting value proposition. And they said, you know, Dell, really? You don't need to be making these things. We guarantee you that if you take all of the stuff off your books, and your return on assets will be fantastic. When your return on assets will be fantastic because you won't have any more assets, but that's beside the point. So Dell looked at it, considered it, thought, wow, what a great deal. 20% reduction, and Dell saw remarkable profits. In fact, the highest profits in the organization's history because while their revenues hadn't increased, they had wiped all that stuff off their books. A couple years later, ASUSTeK came back, but this time they didn't go to Dell, they went to Best Buy. And they said to Best Buy, you know, you have all these computer manufacturers on your shelves. You have Compaq, you have Hewlett-Packard, you have Dell. Well, what if we put your name on those computers and you were able to buy them from us for 20% less? Of course, Best Buy loved it, and Dell was completely out of the computer manufacturing business. The personal computing business, I should say. And so what does this tell us? Well, unfortunately for publishers, I think, we're already well down this road. And if you walk through, you can look at this yourself and see that most of this stuff has already happened. We've outsourced, a lot of organizations have outsourced their copy editing and layout, they've outsourced their printing, outsourced their advertising and tools, and now obviously distribution, we outsourced to the newsfeed, Google News, and timelines. And so the next natural evolution is outsourcing instant articles, AMP, and Moments as a wonderful way of our publishing systems. I'm not suggesting that we don't play in this space, and you know, the Boston Globe is one of those places that is definitely playing in this space, and we're exploring it like everybody else. I'm just merely pointing out that where does this end? And I do think these are questions that we should consider when we are taking on these deals. So there's really three questions that I want to pose as we take this on. The first one that I just outlined is the business model and the strategic imperative of these risks. The second one, and this is one that I speak on behalf, I think, of most publishers who don't have technology teams that are massive, but who have legacy systems. The Boston Globe is a tremendously successful news organization at the regional level. I do feel that we have a responsibility at the Globe to speak on behalf of those that don't have as large of a voice as we do when it comes to implementing the technology piece in all of this. Every time we have a Google AMP feed that we have to build, or a Facebook Instant Articles feed, while everybody would tell you, yes, it's just a it's just a WordPress open source plugin, you just drop it in, it's never that simple. There's analytics that have to be dropped in, there's A/B testing that has to happen, there's revenue components that you have to work with on your ad servers. All of these things take the opportunity cost away from other things that we need to do in order for our own business, our core business, to be successful. And while we do them, it is important to note that it isn't as simple as everybody thinks it is. And when you don't have a technology team that is large enough to handle that, it's a consideration. But that I can actually live with, because that is essentially why you would outsource it. It's really the third one that I think we should talk about a lot. And I know Emily Bell has championed these issues a lot recently, and I completely rally behind Emily on these, where, you know, technology, these platforms are driven and focused on scale, they're focused on reach, and they're focused on engagement, whereas journalism is focused, if it's doing it right, on impact. And I would argue that I don't think those things are always compatible together. They can be at times, but not always. And so just a couple of considerations on this. You know, I think Josh Benton wrote a Neiman Lab article a couple of weeks ago where he talked about the East Coast, West Coast bias of these platforms, and I think that that's absolutely true. One way to just look at that is whenever there's a new platform, a Snapchat Discover, or a Twitter Moments, or a Facebook Instant Articles, look at who the initial partners are who get to sign up for these things first. Is the Dallas Morning News one of them? Is the Boston Globe one of them? Probably not. Billy Penn was successful in being a small publication that was able to get on Instant Articles, but for the most part, what we're talking about are the New York Times, BuzzFeed, Vox, Vice, all of the ones that you would imagine on the East and West Coast. And I think there's something there that we need to think about as to why that bias exists. They also pay these publications, which is something that we'll talk about. So the question is, you know, a free press is no longer a free press if it's controlled by the few. And it's important to understand there's also a national versus a local bias on this. And I'm just riffing off some points here on this issue, which are that these platforms are essentially at war with each other, and we're kind of caught in the crossfire. While I think Mark Zuckerberg is a terrifically kind human being, Mark Zuckerberg is accountable to his shareholders. He's not accountable to us. And so as news organizations, again, I just wanted to pose some questions as we go down this path about the potential risks, and then we can talk about the solutions in the other panel. Thank you.